Auras are generally a weak type of card due to the inherent disadvantages of them being weak to removal and easily getting 2 for 1. Despite that, a huge number of auras have left their mark on the game, so we're going to be covering those today. Starting us off at number 10, we have On Thin Ice. This is a Snow enchantment aura, Snow being a subtype with some synergies, with a mana cost of 1 white. It has enchant Snow land you control, and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you exile target creature an opponent controls until On Thin Ice leaves the battlefield. There are a lot of auras that act as a form of removal, but On Thin Ice is the most powerful of the bunch. You see, other aura removal spells usually make it so that the creatures can't attack or block, which means that the creature keeps all of its abilities. So if the creature you're trying to remove has some good abilities, your removal spell won't really do anything against them. However, since On Thin Ice exiles the card, if you use the ability to exile a creature, it won't be able to do anything at all since it isn't even on the battlefield. Now, there are some auras that do act as a more effective form of removal as well, such as Song of the Dryads. However, these cards are quite a bit more expensive to cast than On Thin Ice, so they see significantly less play. On Thin Ice has the downside of needing to enchant certain lands, but with cards like Prismatic Vista, decks are able to find their Snow basics very easily to enable the card. Due to all of these upsides, On Thin Ice was a pretty common removal spell for Snow decks in Modern after release of Modern Horizons 1. However, On Thin Ice has fallen out of favor recently. The banning of Arcum's Astrolabe made Snow decks a lot less popular, which really hurt the card's viability in Modern. On top of that, there are other removal spells like Prismatic Ending that are easier to play and don't have the downside of letting your opponent get their card back if they remove the enchantment. The release of these stronger removal spells have kind of pushed On Thin Ice out of the format, so On Thin Ice isn't really seeing too much play in Modern right now, but if it were legal in weaker formats like Pioneer, it would probably be seen play there. Speaking of Pioneer, we should mention Thin Ice's older brother, Chained to the Rocks. This is a very similar card that needs to enchant a mountain rather than a snow land. This card is legal in Pioneer and is seen pretty consistent play in decks like Boros Aggro and Fires of Invention decks. Chained is definitely the weaker card, but it's actually seeing more play right now due to the formats it's legal in. Thin Ice and Chained do a great job of showing off the strength and weaknesses of auras. They're really strong and efficient cards, with the downside of needing you to play cards to attach them to, and having high blowout potential, which is true of pretty much all good auras. And at number 9, we have Threads of Disloyalty. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. It has enchant creature with mana value 2 or less, and the ability where you control the enchanted creature. This is a part of a larger genre of auras that all let you gain control of an opponent's creature, though Threads has seen the most play due to costing the least. Gaining control of creatures with mana value 2 or less may seem a little too narrow, but there are actually a ton of great targets for it. For the longest time, Tarmogoyf was one of the scariest threats in Modern, and Threads can not only deal with it, but get you a threat of all your own. This is an inherent +1 in card advantage because your opponent loses a creature and you gain one. Now, this is all really good, and it's a big part of why Threads has historically seen some pretty heavy play in formats like Modern. However, the card has fallen off pretty hard, and only sees very niche play in Modern nowadays. So, what caused this card to fall off? Well, first of all, the format just got a lot faster. Paying 3 mana for a card that is a sorcery spell is kind of a huge liability in the format nowadays. Your opponent could simply use a card like Abrupt Decay to get their creature back before their turn. Now, this was always kinda true, but as the format has sped up, the blowouts have felt worse and worse, and are more and more likely to lose you the game outright if your opponent has the answers for your threats. The final nail in the coffin, though, was Archmage's Charm. This is an instant that costs 3 blue mana and lets you choose one of 3 modes. Draw 2 cards, counter target spell, or gain control of a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Charm has a few upsides over Threads that overweigh its downsides heavily. Not being able to target mana value 2 creatures does stink, but mana value 1 permanents still include a large variety of really important threats. On top of that, the instant speed and the fact that your opponent can't use removal spell to get their creature back made it a way safer card to use. This isn't even mentioning the other 2 modes, which are used all the time as well. Ultimately, there's very little reason to run Threads now that Archmage's Charm is in the format. Still, the card remains a relatively niche tech option that decks will play sometimes, so despite the card being outmoded by a better card, it still slides onto this list. Next up at number 8, we have Ensoul Artifact. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue, and has Enchant Artifact and the ability where the artifact it's attached to is a 5/5 creature in addition to its other types. Ensoul Artifact can turn just about any artifact into a really fast clock. Even better, if the artifact you're attaching it to was already on the battlefield at the start of your turn, you can attack with it right away because it won't be summoning sick. There are tons of really great threats for this. For one, attaching to Darksteel Citadel will give you a 5/5 with Indestructible, making it a lot harder for it to get removed. One application that may not be immediately obvious is attaching it to artifact creatures. This will overwrite the creature's natural stats and turn it into a 5/5, making Ensoul Artifact a substantial upgrade to a creature's natural stats. Attaching it to a card like Ornithopter gives you a 5/5 with flying. Attaching it to a Stone Coil Serpent will give you a 5/5 with however many +1/+1 counters were already on it, giving you a really big creature that will still have the Serpent's abilities. This will usually give you at least a 6/6 with Trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to your opponent, Reach, meaning it can block flying creatures, and Protection for multicolored, meaning it can't be blocked, targeted, dealt damage, or enchanted by anything that's more than one color. Now, these are just a few of the great targets for Ensoul Artifact, but if we're going over every good target for it, we'd be here all day. Ensoul Artifact has been the backbone of aggro decks in Standard and Pioneer for quite some time now. In 2015, Ensoul Artifact was a great Standard deck, taking multiple top finishes. The deck hasn't seen quite as much success in Pioneer, but it still has more than respectable results. Despite this strength and artifact aggro decks being a thing as far back as Legacy, Ensoul Artifact doesn't see much play any further back than Pioneer. This is mostly due just to there being better cards and strategies for these kinds of decks past Pioneer. And at number 7, we have Daybreak Coronet. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2 white. It has Enchanted Creature with another aura on it, and the ability where the enchanted creature gets +3/+3 and gains First Strike, meaning it deals combat damage before creatures without First Strike, Lifelink, meaning it dealing damage causes you to gain that much life, and Vigilance, meaning it doesn't have to tap to attack. This is a ridiculous rate for an aura, but it is a bit scary to use. Throwing 2 separate auras onto a creature is just asking for it to eat a removal spell and get 3 for 1. And losing that much card advantage on a single interaction is a surefire way to lose the game. However, there is a way to mitigate this. Hexproof. Hexproof is an ability that makes it so your opponent can't target whatever permanent has hexproof with their spells or abilities. Since most forms of removal require targeting, this will make it nearly impossible for your opponent to deal with your creature. Even better, there are 1-mana creatures with hexproof, namely Slippery Bogle and Gladecover Scout. This synergy led to Bogle's decks coming into the metagame. This deck is incredibly difficult to deal with, requiring very specific types of removal, such as edicts or board clears. Daybreak Coronet really shines in this deck. Its combination of a huge stat boost and a swat of keywords makes the deck really hard to deal with. You have to race them because you can't deal with their creature, but Lifelink lets them gain too much life, and Vigilance means they can keep attacking you without leaving themselves open. First Strike is the final nail in the coffin, making it really hard to beat the creature in combat. Daybreak Coronet is a great addition to Bogle's decks, but there are a few more auras that are also played in those decks that are just a bit stronger. And at number 6, we have Ethereal Armor. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 white. It has Enchant Creature and the ability where the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment that you control and has First Strike. This is another card that sees a good amount of play in Bogle's decks. However, this card has also seen some more success in other formats, where Daybreak Coronet either wasn't legal or didn't manage to see as much play. Ethereal Armor has been combined with hexproof creatures in its run through Standard and Pioneer. In those formats, it's seen play alongside Gladecover Scout and Basara Tower Archer, 2 cheap, efficient hexproof creatures. However, the card has also seen play in a slightly less successful deck, Orzhov Auras. This is a Pioneer deck built around Hateful Eidolon, a 1/2 enchantment creature with lifelink and the ability where, whenever a creature you control dies, you draw a card for each aura you control that was attached to it. This does a lot to offset the inherent disadvantage of getting your suited up creature killed. However, having a hexproof creature does that as well as protecting your creatures from removal in the first place, making it a generically stronger card. Now, both Ethereal Armor and Daybreak Coronet are really great cards for Boggle-style decks, but neither of them have really seen play outside of those decks, so it's kind of hard to place one of them over the other. Ultimately, Armor is taking this spot over Coronet because it's seen a little success outside of these kinds of decks as well. And at number 5, we have Rancor. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 green. It has Enchant Creature, the abilities where the enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has Trample, and whenever it's put from the battlefield into your graveyard, you return it to your hand. The ability to return itself back to your hand is a great effect that helps balance out the downsides of auras, not to mention it's already a good rate for the buff. Trample is a really nice ability to give a creature in any aggro deck, because one of the best ways to stall for time against aggro is to simply make a bunch of small creature tokens. Trample lets you push through all those tiny blockers and get through your damage, which can really help creature-based aggro decks close the game. Rancor is kind of a staple of green-based aggro decks, at least in formats where it's legal. Unfortunately, there just aren't all that many green-based aggro decks in formats like Modern and Legacy, which is the only format where Rancor is currently legal. As a result, the card has seen somewhat sporadic play in those formats, outside of Boggle decks in Modern, where the card slots in perfectly. In Legacy, Rancor is a rather niche option for green decks, seeing occasional play alongside the format's powerful cheap threats. This is a huge accomplishment. The fact that Rancor is strong enough to see play, even niche play, exactly the way it was intended to be played in a format as strong as Legacy is extremely impressive. Legacy has multiple different turn 1 and turn 2 combo decks. It's a very powerful format, and carving out a niche in such a powerful metagame is more than enough to put it on this list. And at number 4, we have Spreading Seas. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has enchant land, and it has the abilities where when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and whatever land it's enchanting is an island. Now, anyone who's familiar with Blood Moon will be able to tell at a glance why this card is good, but for everyone else, we need to quickly cover how this card works. You see, when it turns a land into an island, that land loses all of its other abilities. This means that if the land used to be able to tap for any color of mana, now it can only tap for blue. This makes the card a really good way to mess with your opponent's mana, as well as mess with any other land's abilities that might be problematic. There are tons of lands with good abilities outside of making mana, and having a way to shut them off that also cycles is really nice. There are also a few really important applications of the card. You see, one really popular deck in Modern is Tron, a deck that's built around the Tron lands: Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant. If you have all 3 of these lands out, they tap for extra mana. Mine and Plant each tap for 2 colorless, and Tower taps for an impressive 3 mana. This can let players slam huge threats into play way too early. Combating these decks is something most Modern players are thinking of when they build their deck, and Spreading Seas will basically remove one of these from play, as it takes away the land's land types, which is what the effects check for. Making your opponent's lands islands has another upside. It makes them vulnerable to Islands Walk, an ability that makes the creature unable to be blocked if your opponent has an island. Since Merfolk's Lords also give the creatures Island Walk in addition to a stat boost, Spreading Seas has seen consistent play in that deck for years. Now, while the card is good and sees a lot of play in Modern, it doesn't really see play in Legacy. This is mostly because there are just better options, such as Wasteland, a land that you can sacrifice to destroy a non-basic land. So Spreading Seas' success is limited to Modern, because older formats have better options. And at number 3, we have Utopia Sprawl. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 green. It has Enchant Forest, and it has abilities where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, then whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, you add 1 mana of the chosen color. Also, it's worth mentioning you don't need to put Sprawl on a basic forest. You can also put on any land that has the forest type, such as Stomping Grounds. Anyways, this is a great ramp spell that sees fairly common play in Modern decks that are interested in ramping aggressively. Now, you may wonder if this card is better than a card like Noble Hierarch or any other good mana dorks. The thing is, this card can actually let you get 4 mana on your second turn, alongside a card named Arbor Elf. This is a 1 mana creature with the ability where you can tap it to untap a forest. So what you would do is play Arbor Elf on turn 1, on the next turn you'd play a land, cast your Sprawl on an untapped forest, and then use Arbor Elf to use it again to make 4 mana. This is the only way to make 4 mana on your second turn outside of things like rituals, but these cause you to lose card advantage and only make red mana. This interaction has become the backbone of an entire genre of decks in Modern, as tons of green mid-range decks have used these cards to accelerate into strong turn 2 plays. Historically, this was used in Ponza decks focused on using land destruction. These decks would accelerate into Acid Moss on turn 2, a spell that destroys a land and ramps a forest out, putting them extremely far ahead of their opponent in terms of mana. Nowadays, people play a few less land destruction cards and a few more big threats, though the general principle of the deck remains the same. Outside of Modern, Sprawl sees occasional play in Legacy and Enchantress decks. The Enchantress are a group of cards that draw you a card whenever you cast enchantment spell. In decks like these, cards like Sprawl can be a card neutral and mana neutral play, as you don't lose mana if you can tap the land you put the Sprawl on that turn, and if you have an Enchantress out, you get your card back. This is really strong, as you're ramping without really giving anything up that turn. We should mention cards like Wild Growth, which is a very similar card that isn't legal in Modern. We went with Sprawl because of the color fixing it provides and the fact that it's able to be played in Modern, so it's the card people see more often. And at number 2, we have Splinter Twin. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2 and 2 red. It has Enchant Creature, and it has the ability where the enchanted creature gains the ability to tap it to create a token that's a copy of that creature. The token gains haste, meaning it can attack and activate its tap abilities that turn. And finally, you have to exile at the beginning of your next end step. People probably expected to see this card somewhere on this list. This card has some obvious shenanigans with cards that have enter the battlefield triggers. However, the best way to use it is with cards like Pestermite, which can tap or untap a permanent when they enter the battlefield. So, if you have the Twin on Pestermite, and you activate the Twin ability, you'll make a hasty Pestermite and get its enter the battlefield ability to tap or untap anything. With that trigger, you can untap the original Pestermite, letting you activate the copying ability again. Now, there's nothing stopping you from doing this loop over and over, so you can simply repeat it until you have enough Pestermites with haste to kill your opponent right there. Even better, because Pestermite has flash, meaning you can cast it at instant speed, you could hold up your mana on turn 3 to see if your opponent is doing anything that could kill you, and if they don't, cast it during their end step. Then, on your next turn, you can cast your Twin to combo off. This interaction was the backbone of an aptly named Twin decks in Modern up until the card was banned from the format. Now, Twin isn't seen play in any older formats, as there are better combos to be pulling off, but if the card ever did come off the Modern ban list, it would still be a viable deck. I don't think there's any other aura that's had this big of an impact on a format, but there is one aura that's still more powerful. And all the way at number 1, we have Animate Dead. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. Now, this card is a bit old, so the way it works is a little weird. But basically what it does is you put it on a creature in your graveyard. You put that creature onto the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. That creature gets -1, -0, and whenever Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice that creature. It's worded in a bit of a more complex way, but that's to make sure that it works within the game's rules. This is the gist of how the card works without all the bells and whistles. Anyway, paying 2 mana to get a creature card from your graveyard back, with only the small downside of giving it a -1 power and making it easier to remove, makes Animate Dead the second to best reanimation spell in the entire game. The only better reanimation spell is, well, Reanimate, which is a 1 mana sorcery that returns any creature from the graveyard to your side of the field and makes you lose life equal to its mana value. Despite there being a better version of this effect, that hasn't stopped Animate Dead from seeing heavy play. Reanimator decks in Legacy are happy to run more copies of the reanimation cards, running 4 copies of both cards alongside another 4 copies of Exhume, another great 2 mana reanimate. There is another card with a similar effect, Dance of the Dead, but Dance has the downside of making it so that the creatures doesn't untap on your untap step, and you have to pay 1 and 1 black on your upkeep to untap it. Since this is a bigger downside than giving a creature a meaningless -1, -0, Animate Dead sees far more play. Now, having Animate Dead on your creature is usually a downside, but there are ways to turn it into an upside. Worldgorger Dragon is a strange card with the abilities where, when it enters a battlefield, you exile all of the permanents you control, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return those exile cards to the battlefield. So if you bring it back with Animate Dead, it will exile Animate Dead with its enter the battlefield trigger. And then Animate Dead will make you sacrifice it as it's left the battlefield. That will trigger its ability to return the exile cards to the field, which will bring back Animate Dead and let you reanimate the Worldgorger again. You can loop this as many times as you want, giving you infinite blinks of any other creatures you have out, or more commonly, just make infinite mana by returning your lands to the field untapped. This combo shows up in Legacy Reanimator decks every once in a while, but isn't necessarily a staple because bringing back Grizzlebrand is usually enough to win you the game on its own. Animate Dead is only legal in Legacy and Vintage, which is good because it would probably be too good in any other formats. The fact that the card would be way too good in any other format kinda shows why it belongs at the top of this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards you think should have been on this list, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, leave those in the comments down below.